What if the most powerful man in ancient Rome was never meant to rule? What if his rise, his name, his blood were not accidents of history? What something carefully shaped, something hidden, something controlled, something rewritten? Because for over 2,000 years, we've believed a story that feels complete, a story that feels finished. But what if it isn't? What if the truth was never meant to survive? Long before he became Augustus, he was just a boy, Gaius Octavius, born into a respectable family, not into power, not into destiny, not into anything that would suggest he would one day control an empire. Rome at that time was not ruled by emperors, it was a republic, a system built on balance, on competition, on rivalry. Power was never meant to belong to one man, and yet everything was already beginning to change, because there was another man, a man whose name would echo across history, Julius Caesar, a general, a strategist, a force of nature. He did not just win wars, he reshaped the world around him. Every victory brought him closer to something dangerous, something Rome had feared for centuries, bosomed power. But power in Rome was never given freely. It was resisted, watched, hated. And when Caesar crossed a line that could not be undone, Republic turned on him. The Senate chamber was quiet that day. Too quiet, daggers hidden beneath robes, eyes avoiding each other. No one wanted to be the first, but everyone knew what was about to happen. And then it began. Blades chaos, a storm of betrayal. And at the center of it, Julius Caesar falling surrounded, alone. We are going to reveal more amazing secrets. Before that, please subscribe to our channel and like the video and share it with everyone. But death was not the end of his story, because what he left behind would change everything. In his will, Caesar named an heir, not a general, not a senator, not a seasoned leader, but a boy, Gaius Octavius. And in that moment, everything shifted. Why him? Why choose someone so young, so inexperienced, so distant from power? It didn't make sense, not politically, not strategically, not logically, and yet it happened. The moment Octavius learned the truth, his life changed forever. He was no longer just a name. He was now the adopted son of Caesar. And with that adoption came something far more powerful than wealth and vanity. He became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, a name that carried weight, a name that carried expectation, a name that could open doors or start wars. But Rome did not accept him easily. Power never works that way, especially not in a city built on ambition. There were others, men stronger than him, older than him, more experienced, men who had fought beside Caesar, men who believed they deserved to inherit his legacy. One of them stood above the rest, Mark Antony, a soldier, a commander. A man who understood power, and more importantly, how to take it. At first glance, Octavian and Antony could not have been more different. One was calm, controlled, careful. The other was bold, impulsive, dangerous. But they shared one thing. They both needed Caesar's legacy, and neither was willing to let it go. So instead of destroying each other, they did something unexpected. They formed an alliance. A fragile one, a temporary one, but one that would shape the future of Rome. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins, one by one, relentless, unforgiving, until there was no one left. Revenge had been completed, but power was still unresolved, because alliances built on necessity never last. Slowly, silently, things began to change. Tension grew, trust faded, and Rome, once again, stood on the edge of conflict. But something about Octavian was different. He did not rush, he did not react. He watched, he waited, he learned. He understood something others did not. Power is not always taken by force, sometimes is taken by patience. And while Antony chased glory, Octavian built influence, quickly, carefully, strategically. He gained support in the Senate, he shaped public opinion, he controlled narratives, and most importantly, he controlled how he was seen. because image in Rome was everything. But then, something strange began to happen. Stories started to change, records began to shift, details became unclear. The story of Caesar's heir became more polished, more refined, more perfect. Almost as if had been edited, because Octavian was not just building power, he was building identity. He presented himself as the rightful son, the chosen one, the continuation of Caesar. But adoption is not blood, and in a world obsessed with lineage, with ancestry, with heritage, that difference matters. So how did he convince an entire empire to accept him? That is where the mystery begins, because centuries later, when historians began to re-examine the past, they noticed something unusual. The records of Augustus are too clean, too consistent, too controlled, almost as if someone made sure only one version of the story survived. But history is never that simple. Buried beneath layers of time, beneath rewritten texts, beneath carefully preserved narratives, there are always fragments. Fragments that don't fit, fragments that raise questions. And in recent years, science has started to look at those fragments differently. Not through texts, not through stories, but through something far more permanent: DNA. Because unlike history, DNA does not lie, it does not rewrite itself, it does not protect reputations, it does not care about power, it simply records. And what it records can sometimes challenge everything. But here's the problem: there is no confirmed DNA sample from Augustus himself, no preserved body, no verified remains. So how do you study the bloodline of a man who lived over 2,000 years ago? You look around him, you study his family, his relatives, his lineage, you trace the lines that connect to him. And that is exactly what researchers began to do. They examined burial sites, ancient tombs, fragments of bone, pieces of history, long forgotten. And what they found started to raise new questions, because the genetic patterns didn't always align with expectations. Some lines matched, some didn't. Some connections were clear. Others were missing, and the deeper they looked, more complicated the picture became, because the Julian family was not just a family, it was a symbol, a constructed identity, a legacy tied to myth. They claimed descent from Venus, from gods, from legends. But DNA does not recognize mythology, it recognizes only truth. And sometimes that truth doesn't match the story. So what if Bloodline of Augustus was not what it seemed? What if the man who became Rome's first emperor was not the biological continuation of the legacy he claimed? What if his identity was shaped, not inherited? Because power, in ancient Rome, was not just about strength, it was about perception. And if you could control perception, you could control everything. But controlling perception requires one thing above all else: silence. Silence of opposing voices, silence of conflicting evidence, silence of inconvenient truths. And for centuries, that silence held until now, because modern science is beginning to listen to what history ignored, and what it's hearing is unsettling: small inconsistencies, subtle contradictions, but parts that don't quite fit. Nothing definitive, nothing absolute, but enough to make one thing clear: the story of Augustus is not as simple as we thought. And perhaps I never was, because if his bloodline, if his identity, if his rise to power was even slightly different from what we've been told, then everything changes. Not just the story of one man, but the story of Rome itself. And maybe that's exactly why truth was buried, because some histories are not meant to be questioned, and some legacies are not meant to be examined. But now, questions are being asked, and once a question is asked, it cannot be undone. Because the deeper we look, more we realize this was never just about power, it was about control. control over history, control over identity, control over truth. And if Augustus controlled all three, then who was he before the story was written? Because the man history remembers may not be the man who truly existed. And the bloodline we believe in may not be real. But if that's true, then the foundation of Rome's greatest legacy was built on something else, something hidden, something altered, something we are only now beginning to understand. The story felt complete. A young man rises, a republic falls, an empire is born, and at the center of it all, one name survives: Augustus. But what if that story was only the surface? What if everything we thought we understood was built on something carefully controlled? Because when we look closer, when we move away from polished history, step into the fragments, cracks begin to appear. It begins with a simple question, not about power, not about war, but about identity. Who was Augustus before he became Augustus? Not the title, not the legend, but the person, because history gives us a version, a clean version. A version where everything aligns perfectly. A boy is chosen, adopted by Julius Caesar, given a name, given a destiny, and from that moment forward, everything seems inevitable. But real history is never inevitable. It is messy, uncertain, contradictory, and when something looks too perfect, it usually means something has been removed or rewritten. Because adoption in ancient Rome was powerful, but it was also political. It was not about family. It was about control. A name could be transferred. A legacy could be transferred. Power could be transferred, but blood could not. And in a society obsessed with ancestry, that difference mattered more than anything. So how did Octavian transform that weakness into absolute authority? The answer lies not in what he inherited, in what he created, because Augustus did not just rule Rome. He reshaped how Rome remembered. He controlled records. He influenced writers. He ensured that the version of history that survived was the version that served him, and for centuries, that version held. Until something changed, because modern science does not rely on stories, it relies on evidence. And slowly, carefully, researchers began to look at the past differently. They turned to burial sites, to skeletal remains, to fragments of genetic material, not searching for proof of greatness, rather for traces of truth. And what they found was not simple, because ancient DNA is fragile, incomplete, damaged by time. It does not give clear answers. It gives patterns. And patterns can be unsettling. When researchers began studying individuals linked to the Julian line, they expected consistency, a traceable lineage, a clear genetic thread, but instead, they found variation. Some connections aligned with expectations, others did not. Some genetic markers suggested continuity, others suggested divergence. At first, this was dismissed. Contamination, incomplete samples, natural variation. But as more data appeared, pattern became harder to ignore. Because the inconsistencies were not random. They hinted at something deeper, something structural, something that suggested lineage itself may not have been as stable as believed. And that raises a difficult question. If the bloodline was not consistent, then what exactly was being preserved? Because Augustus built his authority on legitimacy, not just power, not just military strength, but legitimacy. The idea that he was the rightful continuation of something greater. But what if that legitimacy was constructed? What if the connection to Caesar was stronger in narrative than in reality? Because adoption gave him the name, but it also gave him something else. A mask, a way to become someone else. And if that transformation was successful, then the original identity would slowly disappear, replaced by something new, something designed, something controlled. But here's where the story changes. because identity in ancient Rome was not just personal, it was public. It was shaped by how others saw you, and Augustus understood that better than anyone. He did not present himself as a conqueror, he presented himself as a restorer, a man bringing order, a man restoring balance, a man honoring tradition. But beneath that image, he was doing something far more radical. He was redefining power itself, because instead of seizing control openly, he absorbed it quietly, gradually, completely. And in doing so, he made resistance almost impossible. But controlling power is one thing. Controlling memory is something else entirely, because memory shapes reality. And if you control memory, you control how the future understands the past. Augustus invested heavily in this: monuments, inscriptions, literature. Everything was designed to reinforce a single narrative, a narrative where his rise was justified, where his rule was necessary, where his identity was unquestioned. But the more perfect a narrative becomes, more fragile it is, because perfection cannot tolerate contradiction, and contradiction always finds a way to surface, even after 2,000 years. Because the fragments remain, hidden, buried, waiting, and now, with modern tools, we are starting to uncover them. But what we find is not a clear answer. It is something far more unsettling. Possibility, because the evidence does not prove a single alternative. It opens multiple ways the story could be different, multiple ways the truth could have been altered. And that uncertainty is where the real mystery lies, because we are not just asking, was Augustus who we think he was? We are asking, what if we can never know? Because identity built on power is difficult to verify, especially when that power controlled the narrative itself. And yet, there are still clues, subtle ones: the speed of his rise, the precision of his messaging, the consistency of his portrayal. All of it suggests something deliberate, something planned. Because no one rises that smoothly in a system designed to resist domination, unless the system itself is being reshaped. And Augustus reshaped everything: politics, culture, history. Even the idea of Rome itself, but in doing so, he may have erased something that existed before the transformation, something that no longer fits the official story. And that brings us back to the question of blood, because bloodlines are more than biology. They are symbols. They represent continuity, stability, legitimacy. But if that continuity is broken, even slightly, then the symbol loses its foundation. And if the foundation is uncertain, then everything built on top of it becomes uncertain too. So what does that mean for Augustus? It means his power may not have come from inheritance, but from creation. From constructing an identity so strong, so convincing, so complete, that it replaced reality itself. And if that is true, then Augustus was not just Rome's first emperor, he was something else. Something more complex. A man who understood that controlling the story is more powerful than controlling the truth. Because stories survive, they are passed down, repeated, believed. And over time, they become reality. But truth does not always survive, sometimes disappears, lost in translation, lost in rewriting, lost in silence. And when that happens, we are left with something incomplete. A version of events that feels real, may not be, and that is where we are now, standing between history and possibility. Between what we know and what we are only beginning to question, because the DNA evidence doesn't give us a final answer. It gives us doubt, and doubt is powerful. Because once doubt exists, certainty disappears. And without certainty, past becomes fluid, open to reinterpretation, open to revision, open to change. And that is both exciting and unsettling, because it means story of Augustus is not finished. It is still evolving, still being examined, still being questioned. And perhaps it always will be, because some truths are not meant to be simple. They are meant to be explored, to be challenged, to be reconsidered. And in that process, we come closer, not to certainty, not to understanding. An understanding that history is not just a record of what happened. It is a reflection of who controlled the narrative. And Augustus may have been one of the greatest narrative architects in human history. So when we ask who he really was, we are not just asking about one man. We are asking about the nature of history itself, about how stories are built, about how truth is shaped, about how power defines memory. And maybe that is the real discovery. Not that Augustus' bloodline was hidden, but that his story was. And once we begin to see that, we can never look at history the same way again. Because behind every perfect story, there may be something else, something unfinished, something waiting to be uncovered.